later.
10 seconds later.
12 seconds later.
1 minute, 37 seconds later.
5 minutes later. 11 minutes later. 15 minutes later.
20 minutes later.
346 minutes later. Much later. Much later. Much later. 1 nap later. Later, in the void. Approximately 10 hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 1 hour later.
2 hours later.
3 hours later. 5 hours later. 6 hours later.
6.5 hours later.
7 hours later. 8 hours later. 24 hours late. 72 hours later.
A few inches later.
2 days later.
3 days later.
1 week later. 2 weeks later.
3 weeks later.
4 to 6 weeks later. 6 months later. Many hours later.
Many months later.
Many unbearable hours later. 298 frozen patties later.
2,000 years later.
3,000 years later.
80,000 impressions later.
1 debt to society later. 1 pair of pants later. A little longer than a few minutes later. 1 season later. 16 paranoia-filled days later. 75 years later. Thousands of tears later. 1 extremely annoying shift later. 2 very boring minutes later. 1 winner later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
1 shift later. A lot of boring math later. 1 long angry line later. Moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
12 o'clock midnight. 3:28 a.m.
7:59 a.m.
8:01 p.m.
Opening night.
The next day.
Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. Early the next morning. Yesterday.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure.
The following day. The following Thursday. The next morning. The next morning. The next day.
Eventually.
Meanwhile. Epilogue. Soon after. Just then. Flashback. End of flashback.